This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jill Newbron, and here are tonight's top stories. The U.S. administration says no more international students for Harvard University, citing alleged links to the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing accuses the U.S. of politicizing education. Chinese Premier Li Qiang starts a charm offensive in Southeast Asia this weekend, visiting Indonesia first, then Malaysia. Core inflation in Japan accelerating at its fastest annual pace in more than 2 years, raising the odds of another interest rate hike by year's end. Landslides in southwest China's Guizhou killed at least 4 people, rescuers struggling to reach those still trapped in the mountainous region. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, South Korea says they have not discussed withdrawing troops with the U.S. after a report suggests that Washington is looking at redeploying forces. How would such a move impact regional security? We'll get insights from an expert. But first, China has vowed support for its overseas students and scholars after the United States barred Harvard University from enrolling international students. Washington says the university was perpetuating an unsafe campus environment and was coordinating with the Communist Party of China.
中美教育合作是互利的，中方一贯反对将教育合作政治化。 美方有关做法只会损害美国的形象和国际信誉。中方将坚定维护海外中国学生和学者的正当合法权益。
The U.S. Department of Homeland Security has ordered the university to comply with federal requests within 72 hours. Or remain banned from the Student and Exchange Visitor Program. This comes after the university refused to provide information that the department had previously demanded about some foreign students' visa holders at the institution. Harvard said the Trump administration's move was a retaliation and could seriously harm the country. It says the move will affect thousands of international students, with nearly 7,000 enrolled this year alone, and that's about 27% of its total enrollment. The Homeland Security Secretary says the Trump administration is considering similar moves at other universities. Well, let's go straight to Beijing, where CNA's Tan Se-Hui joins us with more. Se-Hui, first of all, elaborate on China's response and reaction, especially in light of the university's alleged links with the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, let's start with the Chinese student body at Harvard. There's a mix of confusion and anxiety among especially those enrolling into Harvard University. Well, first, anxiety and confusion because they have not received any specific notification from Harvard University. They're also anxious because they don't know whether matriculation will be affected, whether there will be a delay in matriculation. But overall, they are holding out hopes, hoping that such a radical decision will not materialize. Now, we've heard earlier the Foreign Affairs Ministry, it said, and opposed the fact that there is a sort of a politicization of educational collaboration. They've also said that they will safeguard the legitimate rights of their overseas students. But analysts are saying that this is just a statement. There's nothing that China can do. Even if they want to retaliate, they could possibly restrict U.S. students from coming to study in China. But there's already a restriction in terms of research collaboration between both countries. So if anything, this statement does not really have much practicality. At most, it is more of a furthering of rivalry. Now, while we're talking about the fact that there have been statements that allude to the fact that this ban is due to the fact that there has been coordinated activity between Harvard University and the Chinese Communist Party, well, analysts are a bit wary about this because so far there has not been any official mention of any kind of country that is involved in this. And so they say that this move may not be China-specific, and this may not be targeting specifically Chinese nationals, especially since just weeks ago, Mr. Trump had called to eliminate equity, diversity, and inclusion practices at Harvard, So analysts are saying that this could be more of a regulatory move, but more time is needed to dissect the actual significance of whether this is domestic-driven politics or this could be externally oriented. So let's take a listen to an analyst I spoke with earlier on.
Question is whether there will be an expansion of what's happening in Harvard to other universities in the US. I mean, some states like Florida have been trying to put restrictions in place. Whether other states will follow, whether more private universities are forced to take on this position is really what we have to look at. And on the PRC side, we'll have to see whether their response is proportionate. Harvard, yes, it's important to cooperate with Harvard, brings a lot of prestige, but it's not the only counterpart available for cooperation. So a PRC response, if it's symbolic and proportionate, sure, I mean, it's something, but I don't think it will escalate that much.
So wait, whatever the case, Chinese students have decisions to make. Are they rethinking perhaps their plans to study abroad? And, maybe the shine of overseas degrees starting to lose its luster?
Exactly, Jill. So there are important decisions to be made. Around 1,800 to 2,300 students, Chinese students, are studying in Harvard. They are a significant representation in the international body at Harvard University. But even so, analysts are saying that this is a fairly small number when you compare it to the overall Chinese student body. And so while studying in Harvard and other Ivy League universities, it's still a sort of a social prestige. There is sort of more of a movement now to stay in China and to study here. Especially with China setting out a roadmap to become a leading education power by 2035. It could become more enticing to stay here. I read some comments online. Some even joked that this Trump move could aid China's rise. So a study abroad consulting agency has issued a reminder to students and parents who have plans to study abroad to consider choosing, have a change in plans in where they hope to study. So they even said that there could be an impact on students planning to study here in China because they've cited places like Westlake University, Fuyao University of Science and Tech. These are private universities that are funded by top entrepreneurs, and they have begun large-scale nationwide recruiting of undergraduates. So top talent is being recruited even from places like Korea. They're recruiting international scholars. So they're saying that one day these private universities could outcompete the current top public universities like even Peking and Tsinghua University. And so the reality here in China could be very much different in the future.
All right, leave it there for now. CNA's Tan Sehui reporting live from Beijing. Now, we want to find out what the students themselves think. So for more insights into how this impacts students who were meant to start this academic year, we now speak to Vince. He would like to be known by his first name, Vince, and he joins us from Taipei. Vince, first of all, thanks for joining us. Curious, what was your initial study plan and how has all this development affected that?
Well, let me begin by saying that I'm actually very grateful for Harvard accepting me to study there and also for the United States to accept me because of all the nature of the higher education. I plan to study quantitative research in the public health field. And initially, the hassle was about all the federal and the NHI funding cuts, which severely affects how business were done in Harvard. And since the nature of my field is mostly related to public funds, so that's a big issue. But then the problem escalated. As for now, it's not really about how well I and the program itself can sustain, but rather whether I can actually be there by the legal status of us being there is now being threatened.
So what are you going to do? Are you going to take a wait-and-see approach or are you going to shelve it completely? What's next?
Well, so far we learned that there's a 72 hours responding period for Harvard to trying to strike a deal with the American administration. So for the near future, it's best for us to just wait and see if there is a deal that can come out. But for the worst case, there are certainly some alternative plan that I have to make.
Yeah, talk to us about that alternative, because I'm sure it must be a very emotional time for you. So in terms of how you're feeling about all this, but at the same time having to come up with a plan B or a plan C.
Yeah. So since for those who are not so familiar with the admission cycles, it's currently May, so it's far past what most graduate schools are intaking application, which would be last November to around December. So it's pretty much impossible for me to try to switch to knowledge school, particularly because I only applied to a handful of graduate school this cycle. So as a medical personnel, my backup plan would naturally be to go back to my residency training, which I already put on hold due to my originally planned master's study in Harvard University.
Well, Vince, we wish you all the best, whichever path you choose. Thank you so much for joining us live from Taipei. Earlier, we spoke to Alex Usher, president of the consultancy Higher Education Strategy Associates, about what the U.S. administration wants from Harvard amid accusations of collaboration with the Communist Party of China.
It's very far-fetched. What the administration wants is obedience. I think we're seeing this in lots of facets of American life. He's trying to bully law firms into not suing his administration. He's trying to, bully cities that are not in agreement with some of his tactics of his immigration officials. And in terms of universities, he simply wants to be able to dictate policy. And a lot of that policy is around measures to help students from minority groups to attend university, which he says is illegal, but is not, in fact. And there are people who are pushing back on his overall agenda. And Harvard is, the richest of the people who are pushing back on this agenda. He's been trying to cut funds from a number of universities to get them to obey, to get them to do in terms of curriculum, in terms of extracurricular programming, those kinds of things. And Harvard's rich enough that they can push back. And so he's found a new way to attack them. He's found another tool. I don't think there's any reason to think that this will end with Harvard. They just happen to be, that's the biggest target he can find right now. And if he can get them to back down, then he can use it on all the other institutions as well. So think of this as a test case rather than there's nothing serious in those allegations. They just want to see if they can get away with it.
Okay, but that said, Alex, I understand that the news is quite new. We hear that the immediate impact is going to be on enrollment, possibly. But I'm wondering how also will it affect international students who are already part of the current cohort, and I guess also those who are about to graduate who have work visas which are sponsored by Harvard.
Right. So my understanding is the work visas are canceled, period. And the international students who are already at Harvard have been told their visas will be revoked unless they transfer to another school. So they're not being told necessarily, the Trump administration can claim it's not actually after the international students, it's just Harvard. But, a lot of those students who are there, they wouldn't be in the United States if it wouldn't work for Harvard. If they are going to transfer somewhere, it might not be within the United States. So I think you might see a lot of them go home. And certainly it seems that these students whose work visas are attached to their time at Harvard, they're simply out of luck. They are pawns.
Well, this is a developing news story, and if you want other perspectives, more coverage on the impact of the U.S. government's move on our website and our mobile app, you can do so. Coming up on East Asia tonight, BYD's EV sales in Europe revs past Tesla for the first time in what analysts say is a watershed moment for Europe's car maker. Despite warnings from the U.S. president to halt production in India, Apple pushes ahead with its plan to expand manufacturing in the subcontinent. Hello, everyone. It's time now for the business news updates with Roland Lim. And Roland, Hong Kong's capital markets having a very good week. Good enough to say they're back on a firm footing?
You could say that, Julie. You could say that. The LSEG data also saying that IPOs and listings in the city have had the best start of the year since 2021. There have been at least 9 listings so far this year and 3 IPOs this week alone. I'll have more details on this in a bit, but first, Japanese inflation has shot up to the highest level in 2 years due to stubbornly high food prices. The core consumer price index, which excludes fresh food but includes oil prices, well, that rose 3.5% in April from a year earlier. And that exceeded market forecasts and is up 3.2% in March. For 3 years in a row now, Japan's inflation has been above the Bank of Japan's 2% target. The latest uptick was driven mostly by a food price surge of 7%. Rice prices spiked around 97% last month, while chocolate jumped 31%. Now, it heaps pressure on Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba ahead of July's elections and after a minister was forced to resign over a gaffe about rice prices, while officials dipped into emergency stockpiles. The Bank of Japan in January raised short-term interest rates to 0.5% on the view that Japan was on the cusp of meeting its 2% inflation target. The data complicates the central bank's policy path. And further complicating things for policymakers is that super long government bond yields have spiked to record highs. Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda said that the central bank will closely monitor the bond market, but he gave no indication of any immediate action. The bank is facing calls to step in and support long-dated bond yields, which are near record levels. Now, that's sparked by concern over Japan's fiscal health. The Prime Minister is facing growing political pressure for big spending and tax cuts ahead of an upper house election slated in July. And remember, Japan has the highest debt-to-GDP ratio among developed countries. One expert explains how expectations of economic support in Japan are hurting market sentiment.
If you look, the U.S. is maybe in some ways the epicenter, but Japan is right there with us. The Japanese 30-year JGB basically hitting the highest yield since 1999 in the last week. And I do think when you look across developed markets, what you see is a consistent story of increasing debt to GDP loads. So again, just taking the total debt, dividing it by national income, we see that rising in the U.S., rising in Japan as people expect more stimulus in Japan after around election time. And then also, I think it's a positive in the case of continental Europe because of defense spending, but we're also going to see materially larger deficits in continental Europe. So across developed markets, a consistent story of rising debt, high deficits. And to me, by the way, for investors, this might be yet another signal that maybe emerging markets might be a better place to commit capital, because in many cases, when you look at emerging markets, there are more signs of fiscal discipline, lower debt to GDP ratios, and still faster economic growth than you get in developed markets. So again, I think a lot of global investors are really rethinking how much of their capital they want in US dollar assets versus other developed markets and other emerging markets at this point. Combine these deficit issues with the uncertainty created by the trade war, with geopolitical uncertainty, and a lot of people are asking questions about their long-term asset allocation.
Chinese automaker BYD has sold more electric vehicles in Europe than Tesla for the very first time. This milestone comes as the carmaker reported a surge in exports this year, particularly in Europe, and deals a blow to Tesla, struggling with growing competition overseas. BYD registered more than 7,200 new electric vehicles in April. That's up 169% from a year ago. In contrast, Tesla registered 7,165 battery EVs, and that's down 49% from a year earlier. The Chinese maker outsold Tesla 2-1 in Germany, 5-1 in the UK. It's now the top EV brand in Italy, boasting an 11.5% market share. With European shipments up 385% so far this year, Citibank analysts say that BYD is on track to hitting its 2025 export target of 1 million units. Analysts credit BYD's growth to its competitive pricing and advanced tech, contrasting with Tesla's pricier and more limited lineup. Meanwhile, Tesla reported its first drop in annual deliveries last year, with analysts expecting another decline after a 13% fall in the first quarter. Production halts to retool factories for its best-selling Model Y have affected output, while some buyers are holding off for cheaper versions of the redesigned SUV. CEO Elon Musk's political involvement has also sparked protests against Tesla in the US and Europe. Now, BYD is not just outperforming rivals in Europe, but closer to home here in Singapore. It's also enjoying a surge in uptake. Now, for more on that, do log in to CNA.Asia for this story on how consumers are shedding their perception of made in China as second best. Hong Kong's capital markets marked one of its best weeks in the past year with two strong IPOs. Success of Jiangsu Hengrui Pharmaceutical, Meraxus and CATL has raised hopes that Hong Kong's IPO market is reviving and the shift to end the city's historic discount to mainland markets. That's happening. Pharmaceutical company Jiangsu Hengrui, as well as Singapore biotech firm Meraxus, skyrocketing in their first trading day on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange by as much as 37% after raising a combined $1.4 billion in separate listings. Now, this follows battery giant CATL's $5.2 billion IPO, which is also the world's biggest listing so far this year. Now, its shares have soared 23% since Tuesday's debut and around 10% pricier than its Shenzhen-listed stock. Chinese companies' Hong Kong-listed stocks have for decades suffered deep discounts compared to their onshore peers due to a confluence of factors, including a poorer liquidity and geopolitical headwinds that often curb investor enthusiasm in the city. The strong showing of CATL and Hengrui comes on the back of a broader revival of Chinese equities in recent weeks, buoyed by a trade truce between the US and China and fresh steps taken by Beijing to spur economic growth. Chinese tech giant Xiaomi has introduced its first self-developed smartphone chipset, which it claims is produced with the same cutting-edge technology that Apple uses. Now, that's a significant milestone for the company as Chinese firms shift resources towards homegrown technology against a bleak international trade backdrop. Xiaomi's new X-Ring 01 chip is built using TSMC's cutting-edge 3-nanometer technology, the most advanced chip-making process in the world today. Now, this comes as the top Chinese smartphone maker announces its flagship devices that will carry the new chip. Founding chairman Li Qiang calls the development of in-house chips inevitable to the great tech companies, adding that the launch of its first chip is just the start, with a long road still ahead. Xiaomi has invested more than $2.4 billion in its X-Ring chip since 2021, with plans to spend another $7 billion over the next 10 years. Previously, among its Chinese rivals, only Huawei has the capability to build competitive smartphone chipsets. Oppo shut down its chip design team abruptly in 2023. Apple is reportedly strengthening its push into the Indian subcontinent, despite President Trump's demand that the iPhone maker shifts manufacturing back to the US. The Financial Times says that Apple's key contractor, that's Foxconn, is moving ahead with a $1.5 billion component plant near Chennai, further expanding the iPhone maker's supply chain in the country. Now, Apple has identified India as a key market for iPhone production and a gradual base for its suppliers in a move away from China. The company currently produces nearly 15% of all iPhones in India, with plans to increase that to 25% in the coming years. The company's assembly operation in India has been a key success story in the government's Make in India push. US President Donald Trump's trade negotiators reportedly pressuring the EU to unilaterally cut tariffs on American goods, warning that without concessions, the bloc will not progress to talks to avoid 20%, quote, reciprocal duties. According to a Financial Times report, US Trade Representative Jameson Greer plans to tell EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič that a recent explanatory note from Brussels for trade talks falls short of US expectations. It adds that Washington is frustrated the EU only offered mutual tariff cuts, not unilateral reductions, which Americans' other trading partners have put forward. Brussels also failed to suggest its proposed digital tax was negotiable, which is a key US demand. The report suggests the EU has been pushing for a jointly agreed framework text for the talks, but the two sides remain too far apart. Both sides are set to hold trade talks in Paris next month. The US is determined for Brussels to take steps to narrow the US trade deficit, which exceeded some $200 billion in 2024. And that'll do it for business.
Have a good weekend, Roland.
Thank you.
Coming up in East Asia tonight, South Korea says there are no discussions with the US on troop withdrawal after the Wall Street Journal claims Washington is considering doing so. What would such a move do for regional security? Well, we'll speak with an expert for more insight in just a moment. You're watching East Asia Tonight. Here are the headlines we're following. China condemns what it calls the politicization of education by the US, saying it will hurt both Washington's image and credibility. Japan's inflation spiked to a two-year high in April as rice prices almost doubled, turning focus on the central bank as it mulls more interest rate hikes amid the Trump administration's trade war. And rescuers are struggling to reach people trapped in southwest China after devastating landslides kill at least 4 people. Now, South Korea has clarified that there have been no discussions between Seoul and Washington over the withdrawal of U.S. troops from the country. This follows a report by the Wall Street Journal that the Trump administration is considering redeploying more than 4,000 of its troops to other locations in the Indo-Pacific. Now, that report comes amid a sensitive time for South Korea ahead of its presidential elections next month. Candidate Kim Moon-soo from the People Power Party had earlier voiced concerns about U.S. troop reductions, saying that the nearly 30,000-strong U.S. forces Korea is key to maintaining peace in the region. Meanwhile, frontrunner Lee Jae-myung from the Democratic Party says that military cooperation was the surest form of deterrence against a nuclear-armed North Korea. Earlier this month, the commander of U.S. Forces Korea spoke against any troop reduction, calling South Korea a strategically vital location between China and Japan. The strategic flexibility issue regarding the U.S. Forces Korea has also resurfaced in recent times as the Pentagon sees a need to focus on its China deterrence. U.S. President Trump has previously taken aim at the deployment of troops in South Korea during his election campaign last year, and he said he would get Seoul to pay billions more to host American troops. Well, for more, we're joined by John Delury. He is the visiting professor at the Department of Political Science and International Affairs at Johns Cabot University. Hi, John. The South Korea and the U.S. have always had strong military ties in maintaining regional stability, but you and I both agree there is no smoke without fire. So I'm curious, what's changed for both countries that's prompted these reports to emerge?
Well, obviously, with the Trump administration, as you said in the introduction, the South Koreans are aware that they're facing an American president who's skeptical of the whole idea of alliance and feels that the United States is getting ripped off, whether it's here in Europe by NATO allies or out there in East Asia by allies like South Korea. So, I was there in Seoul during the first administration, and I can assure you that it was a constant sort of grind on the relationship. Then President Trump's demand that South Korea dramatically increase its contribution to the cost of hosting the soldiers there in the United States. And this notion of some kind of drawdown or pullback, that is not new. I would just add the China factor, which has been increasing in its strategic importance in a bipartisan sense to both Democrats and Republicans in Washington, D.C. And so the whole view, the relative risk of North Korea versus China, that's really tilted. And now when American strategists are looking at South Korea, they are less concerned with deterring North Korea than they are with managing or potentially even deterring mainland China from some kind of future conflict scenario. So that puts a huge pressure on South Korea. If South Korea is not willing and even enthusiastic about joining with the United States in that sort of new strategic planning, then Americans start to say, okay, well, then we need to pull out some of the resources we have in your country because we need to put it elsewhere in the region.
Okay, understand. So what we're seeing is not new, as you mentioned, but also a kind of rejigging, perhaps, of the parameters of the military cooperation between the two countries. They want South Korea perhaps to be more involved and also to pay more for U.S. protection, as you mentioned. But all this, how does it affect the current mutual defense agreement that these two countries have? Is it robust and flexible enough to accommodate these in the coming years?
Well, if you talk about the core of the alliance of the treaty, this goes back to 1953, right at the end of the Korean War. It's been tested in many periods, including large drawdowns of U.S. forces over the history, again, of Democrat and Republican presidents who have pulled troops out to get it to its current level of 28,500, give or take. So in that sense, the foundations are very strong. You also have, during the Biden administration, not one, but two agreements between the U.S. government and the Republic of Korea to phase in increased payments by the South Koreans toward the cost of U.S. troops on the peninsula. So on paper, there's actually agreements extending out, I think, that would cover through Trump's term. Now, Trump's probably not going to want to accept those numbers and those agreements. And that's where you have the new factor of a president who's going to ask for a lot more. The other wild card here is North Korea and diplomacy with Pyongyang, which has been sort of on hold. But obviously, from a North Korean perspective, U.S. forces in the South are seen as a threat to their security. So if Donald Trump and potentially a new South Korean president want to try diplomacy with North Korea again, then what we're maybe seeing here is testing the waters of playing a card. Okay, Kim Jong-un, we, the United States, will reduce by X number of forces our presence in the South to make you feel safer. What can you do for us?
Fascinating, the different things at play here. I want to talk about South Korea, because beyond the peninsula, South Korea says that it is clear it does not want to be drawn into that confrontation, for example, China and Taiwan. Again, does South Korea have that option or that wiggle room to push this agenda? And will the U.S. take that into account?
Well, they have wiggle room. I think that's a good phrase. You know, if when push comes to shove, if there is a conflagration in the Taiwan Straits, if you've got, if we're heading into armed clash on a large scale between the United States military and the PLA, the Chinese military, then South Korea, like pretty much everyone in the region, is going to have to make some very stark choices. But there's a lot that could happen short of that scenario, where you have some level of certainly increased hostility between the United States, maybe, and China. Maybe you have contained conflict here and there. And in those cases, South Korea will have wiggle room, because ultimately there's a sovereign decision that South Korea will make about how its military assets are going to be deployed, how enthusiastically they would support the United States in its military actions in the region. So yes, when you come to it, it's very scenario dependent, and there will be decisions that South Korea will make. If the United States isn't happy with those decisions, then you'd see things like the U.S. pulling out its presence on the peninsula.
Okay, so You know, there are other players in the region, as you mentioned, and these troops could go, if it were to be pulled out, it could go anywhere in the region. But one player is Japan. I mean, how much attention will Seoul be paying to the proposed Japan-US Unified Defense Zone? More strategic worry for them?
Well, first of all, I think it's unlikely. You know, Japan already hosts a larger number of U.S. troops. I'd be surprised if we do see something on the order of, 4,500, 5,000 troops, see them go to Japan. But certainly South Korea watches very closely the U.S.-Japan alliance. There's a sort of competition between these two alliances. And so when Japan makes a outreach with a big strategic concept, or when the U.S. and Japan seem to be working off of some shared strategic script, then that feeds an anxiety in Korea. There's often a term for it, Korea passing, that South Korea is being left out. And of course, the fact that for many months now, it will come up on 6 months, the Republic of Korea has been without a president, without a head of state.
Yeah.
That, of course, has contributed to a real undermining of its position in the region. And Japan has made the most of that. So, yeah, they will be watching closely.
All right. Thanks so much, John, for giving us a better insight into whether the agreement is still fit for purpose or due for a rehaul. John Delury, visiting professor at the Department of Political Science and International Affairs, John Cabot University. Coming up in East Asia tonight, Chinese Premier Li Qiang set to travel to Southeast Asia tomorrow in a diplomatic push just 1 month after President Xi Jinping's tour of the region. Japan and the US have agreed to pursue productive tariff negotiations following a phone call between Prime Minister Shigeru Shiba and President Donald Trump.
私からアメリカの関税措置にかかる我が国の立場を伝えました。で、関税をめぐる日米協議について、まさしく今、赤澤さんがアメリカに向かっておるところでありまして、閣僚級協議と、これが実施予定であるということを伝えました上で、閣僚間におきまして生産的な協議が行われるということを期待しているというふうに申し上げ、先方もそれに同意をしたところであり。
The call comes ahead of a third round of negotiations in Washington, which will be attended by Japan's tariff envoy. Ryosei Akazawa reiterated the need for a win-win deal and a focus on finding common ground. However, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is reportedly not attending this round of talks. Japan, despite being a key U.S. ally and its biggest investor, faces a 10% baseline tariff. It was also hit with an additional 24% reciprocal tariff, currently paused until early July. Also, with trade and U.S. tariffs in mind, Chinese Premier Li Qiang is set to arrive in Southeast Asia tomorrow, just a month after the region saw a visit by President Xi Jinping. The Chinese Premier's first stop is Indonesia, then Malaysia, in a trip expected to rally support for Beijing's fight against Washington's trade policies. And Mr. Li will meet Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto and other leaders on his 3-day visit. China has been Indonesia's largest trading partner for more than a decade. Its combined trade hitting close to $150 billion last year. Over in Malaysia, Mr. Li will attend the first joint meeting of ASEAN leaders and the Gulf Cooperation Council, also known as the GCC. The GCC includes 6 Arab states, including major oil producers Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. President Xi Jinping visited Southeast Asia last month, as we mentioned. He stopped in Cambodia, Vietnam and Malaysia, where he called for unity and he called it the Asian family against the United States' punishing tariffs. All right, we want to bring in CNA's Tan Yuguan, who is in Shanghai, for more on the visit. Yuguan, first of all, what's Li Qiang expecting to achieve out of the talks first in Indonesia?
Well, in his talks with political and business leaders, I think Li Qiang would likely try to pave the way for trade to continue and expand China's access to Indonesia's market. Indonesia, after all, is a very attractive market for Chinese businesses. Unlike China's aging market, Indonesia is enjoying a demographic dividend. Indonesia's median age is just 30 and stable versus China's median age of 39 and rising. Fertility rate in Indonesia is also 2.1 replacement level, whereas China's is a measly 1.3 or lower. So Indonesia has a growing youth market of digital natives. That's fertile ground for many Chinese businesses geared towards the youth. So it's no surprise, therefore, that many Chinese apps and e-commerce platforms like TikTok, like ByteDance, and Lazada, by Alibaba, do really well in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia's expanding labor force also makes it an attractive destination for Chinese capital. We do know that as a nation, right, including Hong Kong, China would be Indonesia's largest foreign investor. China also imports a lot of natural resources from Indonesia for its factories. It's quite telling at the height of the trade war with the United States, when China's exports to the US fell by around 20%, China's imports from Indonesia also fell by 10% in tandem. Just showing you how tight the fate of the two economies are tight. It's worth noting that while Xi Jinping didn't visit Indonesia in his recent trip to Southeast Asia, two sides do have strong and deep ties. After all, China held its first ever 2+2 meeting of foreign and defense ministers with another country, with Indonesia, just last month. Jill?
Still, two top Chinese leaders in Southeast Asia, all in the span of 2 months. I think that's the definition of a charm offensive. What are the reasons behind this diplomatic push by China?
I think really trade is the main reason. ASEAN, after all, has overtaken the United States to be China's top export destination, jumping 12% in 2024 alone. Now, recent export numbers in April also give us a sense of how important ASEAN is to China. At the height of the tariff war, when exports to the US dropped around 20%, exports to ASEAN jumped by an equal amount. Right? It's primarily driven by increases to Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. While we do not know how much of those increases are actually consumed in those countries, it's undeniable that some tariff dodging is going on, according to industry insiders that I spoke to. Right? Chinese businesses are trying all ways to dodge tariffs, and that includes directing their operations to Southeast Asia. And at the same time, China's massive supply chain is a complex ecosystem that cannot be replaced easily. So many of the parts used for assembling these products may still be imported from China, thus benefiting the Chinese economy. So the Southeast Asia is a very critical staging ground for Chinese businesses. What's more, even if there is a truce with the US going on right now, China can no longer bank on the American market, and therefore Southeast Asia becomes its most attractive trading destination. Besides, with China's maritime claim in the South China Sea, it does ruffle feathers in this region, so a charm offensive would be useful to smooth feathers to make sure that maritime claims do not get in the way of business. Jill?
Always good to speak with you, Yu Guan. CNA's Tan Yu Guan reporting there from Shanghai. Now, for more on the US-China tariff war, you can head over to CNA.Asia for this documentary episode of When Titans Clash. It looks at how ASEAN could face what experts call a tsunami of Chinese goods and fears of the impact on local industries. Turning to other news, at least 4 people have been killed after heavy rains triggered landslides in southwest China. Authorities have issued a level 4 disaster relief emergency response and sent more than 400 personnel, including the military, to the rescue operation. Downpours in the city of Bijie in Guizhou province set off 2 separate landslides in just one day. Local police say more than a dozen people remain trapped under the debris. Reports say rescuers are hampered by steep slopes in the mountainous region. China has issued disaster risk warnings for nearby areas which are prone to flooding and rock slides. Separately, a landslide also occurring at a remote area near Guilin City in Guangxi province at 5 a.m. local time. 1 person has reportedly died. 3 are injured, 8 more missing. China's focus on the low-altitude economy is taking flight. industry partners tell CNA that they've seen more interest from foreign buyers this year, despite the US tariffs. Deborah Wong reports.
From electric aircraft down to the batteries that power them, China's biggest drone trade show of the year has them all on display. Industry partners say they've prepared more signboards and brochures in English to meet the growing demand from the global market.
Here there is more technology and using different products for the agriculture, but in India we having some limited products. We are gathering more information on another products like 30-liter, 50-liter delivery drones.
There's a lot of new technologies on this multi-rotor drone, the UAS drone, the latest technology of the drone which is using those hydrogen gas to support the powers.
This is the first edition of the show after China spotlighted the low-altitude economy as a new growth driver, pouring in talent and capital incentives to boost R&D.
目前我们的产品应该算90%都是出口。我们现在的领域主要还是在农业植保领域应用比较多一些。产品呢，大部分还是在东南亚跟南美啊这些农业大国。
The Shenzhen-based company will be releasing a new line of semi-solid batteries that can last longer at the end of the year. GDU, a company headquartered in Wuhan, will be launching new docking stations soon and accelerating its overseas clientele.
在近2年之内，我们也积极拓展了一些像北欧啊，还有一些这种俄罗斯相关的一些客户和厂商。同时，由于这个关税的这个影响，我们的订单的话也有一个急剧的一个增长。
Aside from drone training institutes, China's education ministry said that the country's top 6 universities have started to introduce specialized undergraduate programs in low-altitude tech and engineering as part of the push to expand the talent field. Now, these courses have also partnered with enterprises to allow students to attain industry experience.
Since the low-altitude economy was thrust into focus last year, around 30 local governments included development plans into their 2025 agenda. China expects the low-altitude market to hit US $220 billion this year and expand nearly 3 times in 10 years. Deborah Wong, CNA, Shenzhen.
Well, before we go, just a reminder that Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is set to take office in about an hour's time. He will be sworn in as the country's 4th Prime Minister, along with his ministers, in a ceremony at the Istana, the official residence and office of the President. And CNA will, of course, bring you that ceremony live at 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. Well, that's East Asia Tonight this Friday. Don't forget headlines anytime at cna.asia. Plus, we're also on Facebook and YouTube. Bye-bye.